Well, tonight we begin 1 Timothy, and this is one of my favorite books. I think I say that every time, but I really do like 1 Timothy. I've spent a lot of time in it because it's a book to a preacher, so it's apropos that a preacher should spend a lot of time studying it. I have up here 1 Timothy 3:15 because you could say that this is the central focus to the book. Paul tells Timothy, he says, "If I am delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth." The book of Timothy is a practical letter dealing with individual conduct and local congregation conduct, meaning how we as a congregation here in Monroe make decisions, behave, what our priorities are, and then we as individuals, when we think of ourselves as preparing to serve the Lord as a part of a local congregation, what do I bring to the table? You know, every single one of us, as a member of this congregation, has gifts and abilities to offer, and we have a responsibility before God to bring our best to His service here in Monroe. And Timothy deals a lot with that, with regardless of what kind of a person you are and what your background is and even what your gender is, what is our responsibility before the Lord, and what should a local congregation look like. And so you could say 1 Timothy 3:15 is really the central verse to this book, that we look at how our conduct should be as individuals in the church and at what the church should be as the pillar and ground of the truth. And even as you look at the name used there for the church, it's the church of the living God. When God set up a church, it's not like the dead idols, it's not like the false gods of the world, but when the living God put people together here in Monroe and said, "I want you to serve me," what does that look like? And so as we move into the book, we'll do really primarily introduction here. That's funny. I missed an animation there on one of the verses. As you look at this book, this is Paul's letter to Timothy. So the Apostle Paul, who wrote the vast majority of the New Testament letters, and most of the time wrote them to congregations. This time he writes to an individual. He writes to Timothy. And so we really kind of know a lot about Paul as an apostle. But the question really becomes, who's Timothy? Who's this guy that he's writing to? Who is this man that has deserved or at least received this level of attention from the Apostle Paul? And so as we look at Timothy, let's look at his background for just a little bit. In Acts chapter 16, that's the very first time that he shows up on the scene. In Acts chapter 16, Paul, who had traveled through with Barnabas before through the area of Galatia and Antioch Pisidia and Iconium and Derbe and Lystra, through that entire region. I'll put a map up there of that region for you eventually. But when he traveled through there with Paul and Barnabas, they set up congregations. And then later on, Paul went back on a second journey, and he took along with him Silas. And they went back to visit those congregations in Derbe and Lystra and Iconium and Antioch and so on and so forth. And when they got to Derbe and Lystra, it says in Acts chapter 16, it says, Paul came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. And thus we're introduced to this man Timothy, who Paul will, from this point forward, work side by side with for years and years to come. Timothy is one of those many unsung heroes of the first century church, in that here was a guy who was in the trenches working every day. And this is how he started out. When Paul and Barnabas went through and they set up congregations in Derbe and Lystra and Iconium, apparently Timothy and Timothy's mother especially, and we'll see actually his grandmother as well, were some of the first converts, and Timothy also. And that's really what we know in terms of Timothy's background, is that his mother was Jewish, and she was a believer. We also read in 2 Timothy chapter 1 that his grandmother was a believer as well, and that Timothy also obeyed the gospel. Now, it does say his father was Greek. It doesn't say anything beyond that. What we're really left to believe is that his father was not a believer. And really, we don't know that for sure, but the tendency is to believe that because here you have Paul. Take 2 Timothy chapter 1, for example, and Paul is talking to Timothy and he says, I remember the genuine faith that is in you, which first dwelt in your grandmother and your mother. And he makes no mention of his father. That would be kind of odd to say if his father was a believer as well, wouldn't it? So the tendency is to say, okay, well, here was this Jewish woman. She was married to a Greek man, which was a very odd thing to do in the first place. Most Jews did not intermarry with Greeks at all. And here, the father didn't obey the gospel. The mother did. And you can imagine for a second Timothy growing up and being in that environment of a non-believing father and a believing mother. There's going to be tension in that household. And as so many times you can see even today when you have a split household between a believer and an unbeliever, that tension is a constant part of life, and the children have to choose for themselves. They're kind of very clearly left with the option of I can be like dad or I can be like mom, and they are left with that. Well, Timothy was no different, and Timothy chose faith. So when we look at Timothy, we're looking at a man, as Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 1, of genuine faith. He wasn't just doing it because that's what his parents and grandparents had done before, but here was a man who made it his own. And that is important to understand because that was something that Paul found very commendable in Timothy, was Timothy had his own internal drive to serve God. And the same goes for us, that we need to, regardless of our background, be people like that with a genuine faith. And so here's Timothy, having chosen to obey Christ, not getting perfect support at home in that decision. And Paul, it says in Acts chapter 16 down to verse 2, when Paul came to Lystra and Iconium, that he ran into Timothy, and it says he was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. So here is Timothy. And during the time period when between when Paul had gone there in his first journey with Paul and Barnabas, and then they'd left, several years had gone by, and now these churches are beginning to be established, and they've been there for a couple of years at this point. By the time Paul comes back, they say Timothy's an up-and-comer, so to speak. He is a guy you should watch as a hard worker. He's very faithful. He's very diligent. He loves the Lord. He's a good man. And that's what the brethren said about Timothy. And because of that, Paul desired to take Timothy with him. And thus began Paul and Timothy's lifelong journeys together in preaching the gospel. As the Apostle Paul left Lystra and Derbe, he took with him Timothy. And Timothy went with him, made a very, I guess we could say, a tough decision in that his father being a Greek, he had not been circumcised. And Paul says, if you're going to preach with me, we don't want to offend people, so you need to be circumcised. So as an adult, he made the decision to be circumcised in order to preach the gospel, which once again tells you about how important God's word was to him in preaching it. And so Paul took Timothy with him, and from that point forward, everywhere Paul went, Timothy went. And the only time that they weren't together was when Paul was entrusting Timothy with a job that Paul couldn't do. You can see here's that map of Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. That's in that Galatian region. And then if you look, up here is where Paul started preaching in an area that had never been preached at before. When he and Barnabas were preaching together, they only preached as far as this area right here that we're looking at. But then Paul, he crossed over and they moved into Macedonia. And Timothy went with him. And that's when Paul went to Philippi, he went to Thessalonica, he went to Corinth, Berea, all these different areas that had never heard the gospel before. Paul went. And we read about Paul, but Timothy was always with him. And in fact, when you look at the letters to these various congregations, Timothy is often mentioned as Timothy salutes you as well. You know, the letters written to the Corinthians that says, hey, and Timothy sends his greetings. Or, as you know of Timothy. Because these congregations were familiar with Timothy. In fact, you could say that when Paul went preaching, there was really three major preachers. There was Paul, and there was Silas, who's sometimes referred to as Silvanus, and then there's Timothy. They were kind of the trifecta of men who went forth to preach this gospel in this untouched territory. And so Timothy took great risks in his life in going there with Paul. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 down to verse 17 tells us a little bit more about Paul's relationship with Timothy. He says, for this cause I have sent unto you Timothy, who is my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, who shall put you in remembrance of my ways which are in Christ, even as I teach everywhere in every church. This is a notable verse in talking about Timothy in that it tells us a couple of different things. It tells you about the affection that Paul had for him. He says he's my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, and that there was this deep love between these two men. And it also says that Paul sent Timothy to Corinth, and in the 1 Corinthians letter, if you read through that letter, Corinth had a lot of problems. They had major issues, and Paul was deeply disturbed that the Corinthians were going to just simply fall away, that the church was going to implode and be done with. And Paul could not go himself. What Paul really wanted to do was go himself, go to the Corinthians, grab them by the shoulders, shake them, and get them to do what was right. But he couldn't because of life circumstances. He was too busy in Ephesus. And so Paul said, I can't go, so I've sent somebody to you to help you. And he sent Timothy. Timothy was Paul's right-hand man. He was the guy that Paul thought of as his go-to guy. If I can't do it, I'll send Timothy. And you can even see in that very verse why. He says, he'll put you in remembrance of my ways which are in Christ, even as I teach everywhere in every church. Paul had total confidence that whatever Paul would teach, Timothy would teach. That Timothy was a man after God's own heart. He was a man who had that same zeal and fire to serve the Lord as Paul did. And consequently, he felt confident that if the gospel needed to be preached somewhere and Paul couldn't be there, Timothy was the man to send. Another good example of that is 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. When Paul was kicked out of Thessalonica, after really only having been there a few weeks to a few months. You imagine a congregation that had started in an idolatrous city. So here it is. Imagine you go to a city, and here's the Apostle Paul, and he sets up a congregation that people obey the gospel, and they start a congregation, and then after, let's just say 2 months, after 2 months, Paul has to leave. What are the chances that a congregation that has existed for 2 months or less is going to be successful and continue after Paul leaves? Not much of a chance at all. Paul was forced out because, they drove him out of town, essentially. And what Paul did is he was worried. He was terrified for that congregation. He was terrified for the Thessalonians that here are these brethren, and they were good people and they obeyed the gospel, but they're just a bunch of baby Christians. How could you possibly expect them to hang in there without any support system? And Paul couldn't go back, and so look at what it says in 1 Thessalonians 3. When Paul couldn't go back to Thessalonica, who did he send? Timothy. Timothy was the man that Paul entrusted with the most precarious situations. And so I just want you to look at that in terms of understanding that here is Paul. And when he looked at Timothy, he says, you are the guy for the tough jobs that I've got. And so he says, I sent Timothy, our brother, and God's minister in the gospel of Christ to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith. And really, as you look at Timothy, that's what Timothy is. Timothy is a minister. He is a preacher. He was not an apostle. He was not an elder in the Lord's church. He was a minister, a preacher. He did what I do, except a whole lot better. And he was a man who went around and went with Paul, learned at the feet of Paul, and had that same drive to preach the gospel as Paul did. And you can see there in Hebrews 13:23, the next verse I have down there, that Timothy was willing to suffer for the gospel. It says there in Hebrews, know that our brother Timothy has been set at liberty. When it says somebody has been set at liberty, another way of saying that is set free, what does that tell you was before? He was imprisoned. And so Timothy had been in prison for the gospel. He had suffered for preaching the truth. And so when Paul was in prison, Timothy was there. When Paul was preaching, Timothy was there. In fact, it's interesting, the cities that Timothy was from were Derbe and Lystra. Well, Lystra, when Paul preached there the first time, the reason he left Lystra is because they stoned him and left him for dead. I want you to imagine for a second, and just in your mind's eye, go through this story with me. Here's Timothy. He obeys the gospel having heard it from Paul. And here's Paul. The church is beginning. Things are going well, and he looks at Paul, and he hears what Paul is preaching. And then Paul ends up leaving because he was stoned half to death, so much to the point that they actually thought he was dead. They dragged him out of town. They thought he was dead, and he wasn't. And that's why Paul left. And then a couple years later, this same guy who you remember being so bludgeoned by stones that he looked as if there was no life left in him, he comes up to you and says, Timothy, I've heard good things about you. I've heard you are a man with fire in his belly. I've heard that you're the kind of guy that wants to preach the gospel. How about you come with me and you can do what I do? Well, if I'm Timothy, I'm thinking, I want to preach, but I don't want to preach where guys get stoned. I remember what you looked like last time you were here. And yet Timothy went. And we see that Timothy stuck by Paul's side when others fled. When Paul was imprisoned in Rome, Paul wrote multiple times saying that people were ashamed of his chains. They were ashamed to be around him, but not Timothy. Paul said of Timothy that Timothy was somebody who stuck by his side, that he said he was a like mind. In fact, you could say Philippians 2:20, where Paul writes of his relationship with Timothy, kind of sums the whole thing up. He says, for I have no man like-minded who will truly care for your state. That's what Paul said about Timothy. He says, he is the one guy on this planet who sees things the way I see it. That is quite the compliment from the Apostle Paul, isn't it? Can you imagine? Can you imagine if you were to live life and to live it in such a way that the Apostle Paul, after all he had been through, would look at you and say, that's the guy that thinks like I do. That's the guy who's willing to give up the same things that I'm willing to give up for the sake of the gospel. So that's Paul and Timothy's relationship, and it was a very positive one. It was one of affection and love and determination and side-by-side striving for the gospel. They were both men who had a great love for the Lord, and Paul had great affinity for Timothy, and Timothy had great respect for Paul. So when we read these letters that Paul wrote to Timothy, you have to keep that in mind, and you'll see that relationship as we read through. Does anybody have any comments or questions before we continue in the introduction material here? Yeah. Yes, he did have prophetic abilities. Let's see here. That's going to be 2 Timothy chapter 1, where he said the laying on of hands from me. So Paul had laid his hands on Timothy, and so he had the prophetic abilities as many of the first century preachers did. So yes, absolutely right. And so here's Timothy and Paul, and they have this relationship between them, and Paul writes the 1 Timothy letter to him. Now, it's important to understand when Paul wrote this letter, because if you don't understand when Paul wrote it, well, you kind of miss quite a bit. At the end of Acts, in Acts chapter 28, Paul had ended up in Rome under lock and key. He was under house arrest awaiting trial before Caesar. And that's how Acts chapter 28 finishes, which really, the book ends with a cliffhanger. You never find out what happens to Paul. The book doesn't tell you whether he made it out of court there with Caesar or not. You just don't know with Acts chapter 28. And so I have this slide labeled as Acts chapter 29. And the reason for that is this is what happened afterwards. And we look at the letters that Paul wrote. And as you look at the different letters that Paul wrote, we can actually begin to put together a general picture of what happened to Paul after he went to Rome. He went to Rome, he stood trial before Caesar, and he got out. He was let free this first time. But what will happen is he's going to be let free, and then eventually he's going to be in prison again. He'll go back to Rome, and that time he'll die in Rome. This letter was written in between those two times. So we just got finished covering these books that Paul wrote while he was imprisoned in Rome. Now we're going to read a book after that. So Paul was imprisoned, and then he got out of that imprisonment in Rome. And if you begin to take a look at some of the different accounts, Paul was there in Rome, it says 2 whole years in his own rented house. And then after his trial before Caesar, he went a few places. Now, the order of events here, I want you to understand, is not exact. What we're doing is we're taking a bunch of letters, cobbling them together, and saying this is the most likely series of events. But it might have been out of a different order. But Paul, he leaves Rome. He most likely headed over to Crete. And we know that because in Titus it says that Paul left Titus in Crete. So he left him on that island of Crete. And then Paul, he goes back and he goes to Miletus. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, he says that he had left Miletus, Trophimus in Miletus sick. And so that tells you something. And so here's Paul, and you're kind of tracing the events of where he went by the places that he said he had been. And so, excuse me. And so he goes to Miletus, and then the next thing we see is that in 1 Timothy 1, Paul says, "As I urge you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine." Now here's the thing, is that Paul, he's going to head into Macedonia, into this Greek territory, and he's going to do something that he often did with Timothy. Paul's going to say, I don't have time, or I'm unable to go to this place, but they really need help. So if Paul couldn't go himself, Timothy was his go-to guy. Remember, as we talked about with Corinth and with Thessalonica? And so here's Paul, and he says, I'm heading into Macedonia, and as he left there, he says, I left Timothy in Ephesus. And so here is where this letter is written, is sometime around here where Paul is in this time period between imprisonments, between the first imprisonment that he was set free from and the second one where he would die. And he was visiting different congregations. When he left Titus in Crete, he told Titus, I want you to appoint elders. And when he left Timothy in Ephesus, he's going to tell Timothy, I want you to appoint elders as well, and I want you also to set in order some false teaching issues. I want you to fix that. And so Paul, as we read 1 Timothy, Paul has left Timothy in Ephesus, and these are further instructions that Paul has for him. So these are further things that Paul said, Timothy, I want you to remember this and make sure that this happens in the Lord's church. From Macedonia, you have Troas. You can see there from 2 Timothy 4, he talks about he left his cloak in Troas with Carpus. Paul also mentioned that he had been in Corinth, and then he also talks about wintering in Nicopolis. And then eventually, Paul will end up back in Rome, because in 2 Timothy chapter 1, when we go to read 2 Timothy, that will be Paul's final letter to Timothy. And Paul, in that letter, makes it clear that he is in chains, and he is planning on most likely dying there. And secular history tells us that that is most likely what did happen to Paul. And so Paul, on this intermediary journey, not having much time left on this earth, an older, wizened man at this point, having seen all that he has seen through all of his preaching in the book of Acts, now goes back and he sends Timothy to Ephesus, and he says, Timothy, here's some things I want you to take care of here while you are in Ephesus preaching. And so that is the context, time-wise, of what Paul was doing. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. So let's look at the purpose of 1 Timothy for a second. 1 Timothy was written in 66 or 67 AD as Paul passed through Macedonia, as I showed you on that map. That's when Paul wrote it. And Paul wrote it during this time period where he was instilling in the church the last bits of information he was going to be able to. I want you to think of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus as letters that Paul wrote knowing his time was short, knowing I may have a year, I may have 5 years, I may only have 2 months. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be here, how much longer I'm going to be allowed to openly preach. And so Paul was visiting these congregations, traveling back through these territories that he knew well. There were already congregations, and trying to strengthen them for the time when he wouldn't be there to help them anymore. And so 1 Timothy is written during that time period with that in mind. Another thing about 1 Timothy is you have to keep in mind that this is one of only 3 individuals that we have recorded that Paul wrote to as individuals. You know, he wrote to many congregations, but he wrote to Timothy, he wrote to Titus, and he wrote to Philemon. If he wrote to any other people, which he may very well have, we have no record of it. These are the only 3, one of 3 individuals that we have these personal letters to from Paul. And it is his relationship with Timothy was the most affectionate of them. It was the one that was the closest, where as he says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 20, he says, he's like-minded to me. Paul viewed Timothy as the guy who would continue to do what Paul was doing. He was the guy that, if you could say Paul was going to pass the baton of preaching to in any way, it was Timothy. And so as Paul writes this, you're going to see that reminder to Timothy of this is what your life should be about. And this is how one should conduct themselves, how you should behave, how you should act in this life while preaching the gospel. There are 2 major topics that you could say are in this book. And we alluded to it at the beginning of class. One is dealing with preachers. Paul's going to deal with both positive preaching in terms of Timothy, you're a faithful man, and this is how a faithful preacher should preach. This is what God expects of those who would preach the gospel. And then he's also going to deal with false preachers, those who were causing problems and turning away from the gospel and destroying the church. And so Paul's going to take and compare the 2. And so you'll see him, as he's writing to Timothy about how the church should behave, you'll see these asides where he says, Timothy, this is how a man of God ought to act. If you are to be a faithful minister, this is what you should do. And pay no attention to these people who preach this way, who listen to fables and endless genealogies and like to bicker about questions of no value. So as Paul wrote to Timothy, one of his major purposes was to talk to Timothy about what makes a good and faithful preacher of the gospel. The other, and this is what the bulk of the book is about, is the general work of the local church. Now, there are really 2 types of churches. There is the universal church, which is across the globe, all the baptized, all the faithful are in the universal church. The universal church is never told to do anything specifically. There is no specific leadership of the universal church other than Jesus Christ and His Word. The church across the globe has no centralized leadership. It has no centralized job. It is just simply individual Christians who have turned to the Lord, been baptized, gotten into Christ, and are now living that. But then you have the local congregation, which is you take people who are a part of the universal church that's across the globe, and you take the people who live close to each other, which is really essentially what the local church is a bunch of people who are in proximity with one another. The church that meets in Corinth, the city of Corinth, or the church that meets in Thessalonica. You take those groups and they make a local congregation, and there is specific work for it. There are specific things that God requires of the local church. There are specific tasks for it, and there are specific ways that it should make decisions, specific ways that it should spend its money. And so Timothy, as a preacher of the gospel, was there in Ephesus, and Paul says this is what this local congregation and all local congregations need to do to continue to be a pillar and ground of the truth. This is how they should conduct themselves. This is how they should make decisions. This is how they should pick leaders. This is how they should spend their money. This is how they should make decisions regarding benevolence, And this is how the young and the old should treat each other. And so within the general work of the local church, Paul talks about a great deal of things. He talks about elders and deacons, what their job is, and more specifically than even talking about what their job is, he talks about their qualifications. What qualities need to be in a man before he's considered to be an elder? What qualities need to be in a man before he's considered a deacon? He talks about caring for the needy. The church has a responsibility to care for the needy, but it has parameters and rules for that. When you and I make decisions on how we give our money to help people, we really have very, very generic guidelines for it. You can give your money to just about any cause, in just about any situation where you deem fit. You can say, I wish to be charitable to this person. The church is not that way. The local congregation has more specific parameters set around how and when to care for needy people. Because, as Paul will talk about, the church has specific jobs and it has a specific purpose, and God doesn't want us to get distracted from that as a local body. He's going to talk about worship and what worship should look like and our attitude towards worship. The kind of attitude that we as individuals, when we gather together as a congregation, what should we be thinking? What attitude should we bring, and what demeanor should we have when we approach God, on a Sunday together and we gather together? What's the attitude of a healthy local congregation towards worship? I was going to talk about men and women in the church and men and women's roles and how they should interact with one another, what positions of leadership they should have, where each fits in the scheme of the local congregation. How to treat the young and the old and the young. How it is that when you have an older Christian who has been through a lot, they are mature, they have shown time-tested service to God and an understanding of the Bible, how should they be treated, and how should the younger in the faith look at them? There is a responsibility that younger Christians who are not as mature in the faith have to look to those who have been fighting the good fight longer. And when we cease to have that level of respect that the Lord intended, it affects the local congregation in a negative way. The opposite is also true. If older Christians who are more mature have the wrong attitude towards younger Christians and they crush their zeal, they crush their desire to serve the Lord, that will have a negative impact on the congregation. And so here Paul will deal with both. How should each treat each other? And so as we go and we look through this book, really 1 Timothy is dealing with a lot of very practical questions, a lot of very practical issues. It deals with how should a congregation make day-to-day decisions. What's the thought process that should be used when a congregation has to make those normal, everyday, mundane decisions that add up. Just like in your life, in your own individual household, you make a lot of small decisions that in and of themselves don't seem like much, but if you add them all together, are a big deal. One grocery shopping trip where you go over budget's no big deal. But if you do it time and time and time again, where every time you go to the grocery store you're over budget, that will have a long-term impact on your finances. And the same could be said about how we raise our kids. I think every single one of us could look at how we raise our children, and there's days where you make a decision one way or another, and you look back and you say, well, maybe I didn't do that one just exactly right, but overall we're doing okay. It's the collective sum total of those daily decisions. The local church is the same way. How we think and make decisions as a congregation over the long run will affect us. And so Paul deals with that. He deals with what makes a healthy congregation. How do you decide whether a congregation is healthy or not? Is it the numbers? That's, I think, the most typical way for us to look at whether a congregation is healthy or not is to look at it and say, well, how many people are there? And that certainly plays a factor in what makes a healthy congregation, but it is not the only factor. And so Paul deals with that. What makes a congregation a robust, healthy one that gets that, that grade A approval from the Lord. If we were to be one of the churches in Revelation, one of the 7 churches of Asia, where Jesus Christ said, here's my report card for you, would we get a healthy report card? 1 Timothy helps answer that question a lot by telling us, well, this is what makes you healthy. Are you doing these things? Are you avoiding these other things? It deals with what is a preacher's job. Should he be a pastor? I have put in there because that is a common issue that we have today. The average church today talks about the pastor. I cannot tell you the amount of times where I say, well, I preach for the Monroe Valley Church of Christ, and I'm talking to somebody in the community, and they say, oh, so you're a pastor. And I have to deal with that question either by kind of, well, no, that's not the title I use, and just kind of put it off, or we have to have a conversation about why I don't use that title. Paul addresses that in 1 Timothy. What is a preacher's job versus an elder's job versus a deacon's job? There's some very distinct lines of authority that God puts in the local church, and that's a good thing. And once we begin to deteriorate those lines, we get rid of God's levels of leadership and authority within the church, we're going to have problems. Just the same as if you look in the military, and the military really is a good example because we're told we are soldiers for Christ. If you look in the military, what happens when the chain of command starts to break up? That's when people die. Now, you could say the exact same thing of a local congregation. When the chain of authority begins to break up, that's when souls begin to be in peril because the church is no longer doing its job to protect the saints, to be a ground for them, to hold the truth up for them, and protect them from the false teachings and the lusts and temptations of the world. And so it talks about what a preacher's job is. What's the church supposed to spend its money on? This is a very practical issue. Every Sunday we have this collection, and the money goes into this fund, this treasury. And we're told to do that, and we're told to use the money in a godly way. It is the Lord's money, not ours. Well, what does that look like? 1 Timothy deals with that issue of what should the church burden itself with? What things are appropriate for the church to spend its money on? Just like you can see in an individual what they spend their money on, you see their priorities. What a congregation spends their money on tells you their priorities. If they're wasteful of it, if they're careful with it, if they spend it on physical things or spiritual things, do they spend it more on evangelism? Do they spend it on, a zillion different things that you see out in the religious world as a whole today? You can look at congregations in the religious world today, and they spend money on all sorts of absolutely crazy things. 1 Timothy deals with what really is the church supposed to do? What should it burden itself with in terms of what it spends its money on? It deals with what is the role of women in the church. You want to talk about a hot button issue in today's society, let's talk about women's roles. And women's roles in religion is a very hot button issue. Well, Timothy deals with that and what the Lord says on that subject. It deals with what is an elder, and it deals with what is a deacon. So here you look, and here are 2 titles that you see a lot in the religious world. And in fact, we'll see that elder is, another word for elder is pastor. Another word for pastor and elder is bishop or overseer. You look at those titles, especially ones like bishop and pastor, they are very, very often misused. They are given to the wrong people who don't meet the qualifications, and they're given to people, and they're given more authority than they ought to have. And so as we look through the scriptures, what do these words mean, and what is their job? It deals with how should young Christians treat older Christians. We talked about this a little bit. And it deals also with vice versa. Age is a major factor in churches, and in fact, in the religious world as a whole, there are lots and lots of discussions going on right now in the religious world, because as America sees more and more religious decline, more and more people leaving the traditional denominational world, more and more churches are saying, we got lots of older people, but where are the young people? And the problem they find is that when you have a congregation that has older people but no younger people, you're looking at a dying congregation because it's just a numbers game, isn't it? You only got old people. Old people are only getting older. I mean, that's just the way it works. It's just a numbers game. And ironically, we're also finding in the religious world the opposite to be true. While they're leaving the traditional denominational world, what we're also finding is this huge influx into the community church movements, into these more free-form sorts of churches that wouldn't say they're Lutheran or Baptist or Catholic or something like that. They call themselves community churches, the Vine Church, the Free Church, the Church of the Firstborn. I mean, they've got zillions of different names that they give themselves. But these kind of churches have massive influxes of young people, but very few older people. And they're running into problems too. Because young people, without the grounding of older people, tend to be fickle, they cause problems, there's lots of division, there's lots of infighting and arguing, and eventually you find these groups, as much as some of them start out and they get big really fast. I mean, you'll see these youthful churches, they start and they'll have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people. These same churches, 5 to 10 years later, are non-existent. Or they have fractioned so much that there's now 10 different groups that split off from that, and it's all because of the young people who have no respect for older people. And so it's kind of interesting, in the world outside of Christ, where churches don't do it God's way, they find themselves in imbalance. Either a lot of older people and no young people, and that's not healthy, or a lot of younger people and no old people, and that's not healthy. And so what Paul says is there is a balance and there is a respect that both groups can have for each other. And then last but not least, you could say the whole book really is, what is the purpose of a local congregation? What are we here for? What are we here to do? What is the work that the Lord has for us in Monroe Valley to do? Why are we gathering together in the first place? And if you answer that question, everything else begins to fall in place. If we know what the Lord wants from the Monroe Valley Church of Christ, then every decision we make can be filtered through that lens. And we can begin to say, okay, what we're doing here is good, or what we're doing here is a distraction. So when we understand what the purpose of the local congregation is, everything else falls in place, and we can be successful the way the Lord intended. Anybody have any comments or questions before we close up shop? Okay, well then we'll close up there, and we'll pick up in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 1 next week.